Vince Gill finally revealed the truth about Ricky Skaggs, and it was never the story people imagined. For years, fans assumed silence meant distance, that two legends who shared the same industry must have shared something unresolved as well. But when Vince chose to speak, he did not uncover rivalry or regret. He clarified something far quieter and far more enduring. The truth was this: there was never a rift to explain, only respect that did not require performance, proximity, or public reassurance. So why break the silence now? After decades of restraint, why clarify something time itself seemed to bury? And what does it mean when legacy matters more than misunderstanding, and silence is no longer enough to protect the truth? Long before Vince Gill and Ricky Skaggs were ever spoken of in the same breath, their foundations were already quietly forming, shaped by tradition rather than ambition. Ricky Skaggs was born in 1954 in Kentucky, into a world where bluegrass was not a genre but a way of life. Music surrounded him early, woven into family gatherings, church halls, and community stages where sound carried memory and responsibility. By childhood, he was already performing, not for attention or recognition, but because the music demanded stewardship. It was learned carefully, passed down deliberately, and treated as something that existed beyond personal success or individual ownership. Vince Gill was born 3 years later, in 1957, in Oklahoma. His path into music followed a different geography but carried the same seriousness. He gravitated toward sound itself, toward melody and harmony, learning guitar, mandolin, and vocals with patience rather than urgency. Vince did not rush toward the spotlight. He studied music as a language, one that required fluency before expression. Like Ricky, he absorbed gospel and traditional country not as nostalgia, but as instruction. These were not influences to sample or reshape for convenience. They were foundations to stand on, disciplines that demanded respect before innovation. What matters most in these early years is that their paths did not intersect. There was no shared stage, no early collaboration, no personal bond shaping their direction, and yet something essential was already aligned. Both men were shaped by environments that valued precision over spectacle and integrity over visibility. They learned early that music carried responsibility. That tradition was not something to modernize recklessly, but something to honor carefully, even when the world around them moved faster. Fame was never the objective. Craft was. Even before they knew each other's names, they were being guided by the same quiet principle: do the work honestly, show reverence for what came before, and let the music speak for itself. That is where their connection truly began. Not in proximity or partnership, but in philosophy. Respect often begins long before relationship, formed in parallel choices made far apart, yet rooted in the same ground. By the time Nashville became the center of their professional lives, Vince Gill and Ricky Skaggs were moving through the same industry without ever colliding. Ricky Skaggs entered a highly visible chapter of his career in the mid-1970s when he joined Emmylou Harris's Hot Band. The role placed him among musicians who valued precision, restraint, and tradition at a moment when country music was beginning to stretch toward broader commercial appeal. Ricky's presence was defined by discipline rather than display. He was recognized not for spectacle, but for musical authority, for an ability to serve the song without drawing attention away from its roots. Vince Gill's rise followed a different lane. He gained national attention through his work with Pure Prairie League, where his voice and guitar work brought him into a wider spotlight. The success created opportunity, but it also introduced pressure. Nashville during this period was evolving quickly, rewarding accessibility, image, and crossover appeal alongside musicianship. Vince moved carefully through that environment, maintaining a focus on craft even as expectations grew louder around him. He understood that visibility carried responsibility, and he approached it with restraint rather than indulgence. Although their professional circles existed within the same city, their journeys rarely overlapped. There was no competition to win and no rivalry to fuel. They were aware of each other, but they did not measure themselves against one another. Instead, they observed, each recognized the other as someone guided by principle rather than ambition, someone willing to let consistency speak louder than alignment. In an industry that often encourages collaboration as proof of unity or relevance, neither felt compelled to share a stage simply to satisfy perception. Collaboration was never necessary for validation. Their respect did not depend on proximity or public affirmation. It existed quietly, built on watching another artist hold his ground when compromise would have been easier. This period defined the nature of their connection. It was not forged through closeness or constant interaction. It was shaped through parallel discipline, through restraint, through the shared understanding that some bonds are not formed by being seen together, but by moving forward separately with integrity intact. By the late 1980s, the paths of Vince Gill and Ricky Skaggs appeared to move even farther apart, and it was in that widening space that assumptions quietly began to take shape. Ricky Skaggs made a deliberate return to bluegrass, recommitting himself fully to the tradition that had shaped him from childhood. It was a choice rooted in preservation rather than visibility, one that narrowed his audience but deepened his purpose. In an industry increasingly driven by crossover appeal, Ricky chose fidelity to sound over expansion, accepting the cost that came with that decision. At the same time, Vince Gill experienced major mainstream success. His songwriting, musicianship, and unmistakable voice carried him into broader recognition and commercial prominence. His presence on radio and award stages grew steadily, placing him at the center of a changing industry. Yet even as his audience expanded, Vince remained disciplined in approach, careful not to let success dilute the standards that had shaped his work. He carried tradition with him, even as the scale of his platform increased. From the outside, the contrast between their careers became easy to misread. One artist stepped away from the spotlight to protect a sound. The other moved deeper into it while maintaining restraint and integrity. What many observers failed to see was that these were not opposing decisions, but parallel acts of conviction. Each man followed the path that allowed him to remain honest with the music he served. There were no joint tours announced, no collaborative albums released, no public efforts to explain or define their relationship. In an industry that thrives on narrative, that absence became a story of its own. Silence was interpreted as distance. Divergence was mistaken for disagreement. Fans and media alike filled the gaps with projection, creating meaning where none had been offered. Yet the reality remained unchanged. Their lack of public association was not the result of conflict or separation. It was simply the outcome of two artists honoring different responsibilities at the same time. Silence, in this case, was not avoidance. It was restraint. This is how stories form when explanation is withheld. Silence invites interpretation, and interpretation often seeks drama. But in the case of Vince Gill and Ricky Skaggs, there was nothing to resolve. Only two careers unfolding independently, guided by respect rather than reaction, allowing the music to speak without commentary. When Vince Gill finally chose to address the story that had quietly followed both careers, what he revealed was not dramatic but definitive. He spoke with clarity and restraint, publicly praising Ricky Skaggs not as a distant peer, but as a musician whose discipline and purpose had never wavered. Vince acknowledged Ricky's musicianship with reverence, emphasizing his precision, his commitment to tradition, and his refusal to treat bluegrass as something ornamental or outdated. To Vince, Ricky's work represented stewardship, not nostalgia. More importantly, Vince clarified what had never been stated outright. There was no rivalry to explain, no estrangement to resolve, no emotional distance hidden beneath years of silence. What many had interpreted as separation was, in truth, intentional restraint. Vince made it clear that Ricky's decision to preserve bluegrass, even when it meant stepping away from broader commercial visibility, was not merely understood, but deeply respected. It was a choice that required patience, conviction, and a willingness to accept misunderstanding without response. The reveal itself was quiet, but it carried weight. Silence had never been emotional. It was never defensive or reactive. It was the natural outcome of two artists who did not feel compelled to narrate their respect for public consumption. Their bond did not rely on shared tours, joint recordings, or repeated appearances to prove its existence. It lived beneath the surface, sustained by consistency rather than conversation. Vince's words reframed years of assumption without challenging them directly. What had appeared unresolved was already complete. What seemed absent had simply chosen not to announce itself. Respect, in this case, did not require performance to be legitimate. It existed comfortably without explanation, rooted in shared values rather than shared visibility. This was the truth, Vince finally revealed. Not a secret uncovered late in life, and not a correction driven by urgency, but a clarification offered at a moment when legacy mattered more than perception. Some bonds do not announce themselves. They endure quietly, protected by restraint, and strengthened by the confidence to let misunderstanding pass without interference. Today, the relationship between Vince Gill and Ricky Skaggs stands as something increasingly rare in American music: legacy without noise. Both men remain respected elder statesmen, not because they demanded attention, but because they earned trust over time. Their names carry weight among musicians who understand the discipline required to last, to evolve without abandoning foundation. They are regarded not as celebrities chasing relevance, but as musicians, artists whose approval is measured in respect rather than applause. Neither man relied on controversy to define his career. There were no public feuds, no manufactured rivalries, no narratives designed to sustain attention when the music alone was enough. Instead, their legacies were built through consistency, through decades of showing up, honoring tradition, and allowing the work to speak without interruption. As the industry shifted and trends rose and fell, both men aged with dignity, resisting the temptation to explain themselves or reshape their histories for modern validation. What their relationship represents now is clarity. Time has stripped away assumption and left only what was always present: mutual recognition between two artists who never needed proximity to confirm respect. Their paths crossed just enough to understand one another, then continued forward independently, guided by the same principles even when the outcomes looked different. They did not seek alignment for visibility, nor distance for distinction. They simply followed conviction. Reverence, in this context, has outlasted relevance. Sounds evolved, audiences shifted, entire eras passed. Yet the integrity both men carried remains intact, and that integrity is what endures. The silence that once invited speculation now feels complete. It did not weaken their bond, it protected it. This is the quiet lesson their story leaves behind: that the most enduring legacies are not built through explanation, but through restraint. That respect does not require constant confirmation. And that the quietest respect, when grounded in principle, often lasts the longest, long after the noise has faded. Vince Gill did not expose a hidden chapter, and he did not attempt to rewrite history. What he offered was clarification, delivered without urgency or drama. Ricky Skaggs never required explanation, defense, or public framing. His choices, his discipline, and his devotion to tradition were always visible to those willing to look closely. Their relationship was never fractured, never strained, and never in need of repair. It existed quietly, without performance, sustained by shared values rather than shared appearances. What time ultimately revealed was not distance, but confidence. Silence was not absence. It was assurance. Two artists secure enough in their craft to let misunderstanding pass, trusting that integrity would outlast assumption. In the end, the truth did not arrive as a revelation, but as a reminder that some legacies are built without noise, that some bonds endure without explanation, and that restraint, when grounded in respect, can speak louder than anything ever said aloud. For more emotional stories, check out this video.